My name is Steve Byington. I'm the Cultural Resources Manager at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. For those of you not familiar with a Cultural Resources Manager, basically what I do is make sure that the Air Force's cutting-edge mission merges with the desire to take care of the historical preservation aspects of the base. As you will find out through our presentation, our base basically dates all the way back to 1917. So we have a lot of historic structures, a lot of historic stories that we like to preserve, and that is the role that I serve. I'm also here at AirVenture as a liaison with the National Park Service. So if you want any more information, you're welcome to stop by our booth there at the National Park Service booth. But I'll get started with the history of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. For those of you not familiar with it, it's located in Dayton, Ohio. We're just north of Cincinnati, a little bit west of Columbus, Ohio. The story today basically starts in 1899 with Orville and Wilbur Wright. 1899, Wilbur's mother is very sick. She's spending a lot of time at home and hopefully trying to get better from her disease at the time. Wilbur spends a lot of time with her just at her bedside. Both of the brothers were bicycle builders. They also ran a small printing press where they would publish newspapers in the area. But during that time period, Wilbur, who is a voracious reader, spends a lot of time reading the newspapers as well as various different books and things like that. If you're familiar with sort of the turn of the 19th century, one of the biggest things that they were doing at that time was trying to figure out how to fly. Everybody throughout the world was trying to do it. Otto Lilienthal in Europe was probably the biggest proponent of that. He was flying some gliders, but we also had folks in Brazil, we had people in Australia, all racing to become the very first folks to fly. They weren't very successful at that time period. Wilbur was reading all these stories in the history or in the newspapers about it, and decides that him and his brother are going to start taking this on as one of their missions. So 1899 starts sending off for various different articles and books from the Smithsonian, the latest aeronautical information at that time. In 1900, 1901, and 1902, the brothers have a lot of gliders. They take them out to Kitty Hawk. They're doing gliding experiments. Really what they were working on was the wing design, figuring out the best way to control the aircraft once it got in the air. This is where they start developing the warp wing technology. When they feel like they have the right mixture of wings and wingspan and those type of things, they put an engine on this thing. And in 1903, they take the aircraft that they had built in Dayton, Ohio. They put it in a crate. They train it all the way down to Kitty Hawk because, we have a bit of a rivalry with North Carolina. North Carolina at that time was the windiest place in the United States. And when Wilbur was doing his calculations, he needed the most lift for his wing. So he sent off to the Weather Service to find out where the windiest place was. So they decided they would go down, they would take their aircraft down to Kitty Hawk and make the flight. This is one of my favorite pictures. This actually is December 14th, 1903. The brothers had a huge rivalry between the two of them. They wanted to figure out who was going to be the first one to actually fly the aircraft. So what they did is in December 14th, they were ready to go. They were ready to do their test flight. This is an image from that day. They put the aircraft on the rails. They flip a coin for it. Wilbur wins the honor of being the first man to fly. Unfortunately, he goes down the rails and it plows straight into the sand. So it wasn't a complete flight. They damaged the aircraft, spend the next 3 days reconstructing the aircraft. December 17th, 1903, Orville gets the nod because Wilbur had gotten his shot. Orville becomes the next guy. Orville becomes the first man to ever fly an aircraft. So, but I love this picture because it just shows you, if you've been to North Carolina, you've been to Kitty Hawk, how built up it is now. At that time, it was nothing more than sand dunes. And these people here were actually from the life-saving station there, and they came out just to see these two brothers from Ohio having these crazy experiments. They wanted to see what was going on. Anyway, 1903, as I mentioned, Orville makes the first flight, but really it was just a proof of concept, just the ability to get the aircraft into the air. At that point, they said to themselves, hey, we need to, if we're going to have a successful invention, we need to have something that can fly anywhere in the world. So they go back home to Dayton, Ohio. They've got a friend who has some prairie land just outside of Dayton, Huffman Prairie. And they build a hangar out there, and they start doing their experiments out at Huffman Prairie. This is just an image of the small hangar that they built out here, and then they still had the same railing system that they were using at Kitty Hawk. 1904 is not a very successful year for them, though, because if you know anything about Dayton, Ohio, the prevailing winds changed often. They would always have to put the railing system in line with the prevailing winds. It would take them about a half hour to put these rails in place. By the time they got it all in place, wind had changed and they'd have to do it all over again. So they spent most of that first season just kind of moving the rails around. They also didn't really have, they were using the same aircraft from 1903. It wasn't a very stable platform. So at the end of 1904, they have a pretty substantial crash. And they decide, okay, that's the end of this season. We'll try again in 1905. 1905, they come up with the idea that, hey, we don't want to keep moving this railing system around. We want to see if there's some way that we can help ourselves with it. So they actually developed this catapult system. They create a derrick with a weight on it and a rope that has along the railing system. They tie that rope off to this. They drop the weight, and it pulls the aircraft down the railing system. That gave them enough lift to get it into the air. So, but even at that time, they were still having problems with the design of the aircraft. In 1905, they decide they need an independent rudder on the back of this thing. They also make the elevator a lot larger in the front. After that point, when they made those modifications to the aircraft, they were able to get this thing up in the air. In 1903, 1904, the longest flights that they ever got was about 50 seconds. In 1905, when they make the modifications to it, they get the aircraft in the air for 30 minutes. And the only reason that it came down after 30 minutes is because it only had 1 gallon gas tank and it ran out of gas. So by making those modifications to the aircraft, they had the first sustained controlled aircraft. They had an aircraft that could be flown anywhere. And at that point, they said, okay, we're done doing the test flights. Because as you can imagine, even in Dayton, Ohio, there was a lot of interest in what they were doing. So a lot of people would come out. The brothers were extremely worried about corporate espionage. They were worried that people were going to steal their ideas. So at the end of 1905, they say, we're going to now take this idea, we're going to go try to sell it to the world. Eventually, they do sell it to the U.S. government in 1909, but between 1910 and 1917, the brothers opened a flight school out at Huffman Prairie, and some of the very first aviators in the world learned how to fly here. If you're familiar with the Air Force and the 5-star General Hap Arnold, at the time he was only a lieutenant back in 1910, he learns to fly from Orville Wright himself. He learns to fly on these small aircrafts like this. But as I mentioned, from 1910 to 1916, Orville and Wilbur have their school out there. Here's just an image of Orville flying around above Huffman Prairie at that time period. It's also 1916, the brothers finally start looking at having a tractor system versus a pusher system. Almost all their aircrafts up until 1916 had the propellers in the back. This was the very first one they developed for World War I. It wasn't a very successful model, but it was something that they were making great strides towards. Wilbur Wright passes away in 1912, but Orville continues to spend a lot of his time designing aircraft, and he really gets into engine design. So he spends a lot of time with the war effort, working on the Air Code de Havilland 4, coming up with the Liberty engine that would power that into World War I. So as I mentioned, World War I starts 1916, 1917. The Army Air Corps decides they're going to build a base, and they're going to name it for Wilbur Wright. So we have Wilbur Wright Field from 1917 through 26. I show this image just to show you, the grass fields that they had for all the aircraft out there. This is a series of hangars that they built to start training pilots for World War I. And then we also have some of our buildings out here. This is Building 1 for anybody who's familiar with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It's the first military building built at Wright-Patterson in 1917, and it's still there today. But as I mentioned, Wilbur Wright Field becomes the Army Air Corps' pilot training facility. This is the first class recruits out here in front of the hangars. But because we're going into war with these aircraft, they also have to develop an armorer's school. So they start doing the early experimentation with synchronization of machine guns and propellers, because you can't really have a long battle if you're shooting off your propeller. So all these doughboys over here are learning how to do the synchronization for that. And as you can imagine, we're building these aircraft as fast as we possibly can for World War I. You have to have mechanics to fix all these things. So they're doing mechanics school developed here at Wright Field, Wilbur Wright Field. Part of the story also is that at Wilbur Wright Field, it was a training facility, but in downtown Dayton, they created a place called McCook Field from 17 to 26 as well. This is where most of the research and technology was taking place. This is where they were doing propeller design, wing design, those type of things. They were also doing test pilot design as well. I like to show this image because it shows you that McCook Field was a very long rectangular field, but because of the prevailing winds that I mentioned earlier, the actual airstrips were on the short side. So we have some photos in our archives of pilots ending up in the Great Miami River here. And it happens so often that they eventually, on the hangar that's out there, they put the slogan, the field is small, so use it all. They wanted to make sure that pilots understood that if you didn't plan out your flights, you might end up in the drink. I like to show this picture of one of the first test pilots out there in the 20s. This is Rudolph Schroeder. He was a war ace in World War I. He comes back and works for the Army Air Corps here. He's flying this Packard Lusac 11. This is about 1920. He sets the altitude record in 1920 at 33,000 feet. So, just in this short time period between 1903 and 1920, 17 years, they're going from the flight that the Wright brothers had that was maybe about 20 foot off the ground to getting up to 33,000 feet. The reason I tell the story about Rudy, though, is because when he set that record, the 33,000 feet, as you can imagine, when you get that high, air is getting a little thin. He gets up to about that point, he's starting to get lightheaded. He's also getting a lot of carbon monoxide off of the engine, and he starts getting very, very lightheaded. His goggles start to fog up at that altitude. So unfortunately, he makes the mistake of lifting up his goggles at 33,000 feet. As you can imagine, the temperature is below zero by far at that altitude, so his eyeballs actually freeze open. At that time, he also loses consciousness and starts plummeting to the earth. About 3,000 feet, he manages to regain consciousness and pulls out of that and is able to land the aircraft. But unfortunately, the damage that he did to his eyes, he never could fly again. I don't tell the story to be a bummer. What I do tell the story for is because Rudy becomes the very first air safety advocate. He starts advocating for pilots because at this time we were developing technology so fast that people were worried about the machine more so than the people who were actually flying it. Rudy becomes the first advocate and starts looking at how can we work on things like oxygen masks. He also becomes very involved in creating pressurized cabins and those type of things for aircraft. So, also, as I mentioned, McCook Field is very instrumental in design of wings. We're doing experimentation with propeller design. So it becomes this major production and virtually all of the aeronautic design that's taking place in the United States is taking place at McCook Field. This is a story I like to tell, too, about the Barling bomber. This is 1920. If you're familiar with a general named Billy Mitchell, in 1920, he's the first person to really look at aircraft as having the potential for strategic missions. Before that, they were mainly just used for reconnaissance to fly over fields. He has the idea that he wants an aircraft to be able to take down a battleship. So he commissions a design for a bomber. It is officially called the XNB-L1. It's the first B-1 bomber, basically. He commissions this thing. He wants it to be able to fly at an altitude of 10,000 feet. He wants it to be able to go over 100 miles an hour. And he wants it to be able to carry 5,000 pounds of bombs. The Wright brothers, were concerned about every ounce in the aircraft. At this point, 17 years later, they're looking at how can they carry 5,000 pounds of additional load into the air. I like to show this picture because if you can see right up here where the green dot is, that's a full-size man. This aircraft is massive. It's the very first aircraft to actually have a steel skin on it as well. Up to this point, everything was made out of canvas. It is also the first aircraft to actually have bomb bay doors, because previous to that, it was basically you throw it out of an open cockpit. This actually had bomb bay doors. This aircraft, unfortunately, was not very successful. They did get it into the air. We do have some photos of it flying over Dayton, Ohio. And as you can imagine, because it was commissioned by the military, as soon as they got it in the air, the first thing that the officers back in Washington, D.C. was, hey, we want to see it. Fly it out to D.C., we're going to fly it around the parades and show everybody the advancements in technology. Unfortunately, they get this thing in the air, they start flying it towards Washington, D.C., and it's not able to get the altitude to go over the Appalachian Mountains. So it actually had to turn around. It was too heavy. As you can see, it's got a lot of struts on it. It's got the tri-wing design here. The drag on this thing was so unbelievably large that the small engines that were powering it just couldn't get it over the mountains. So eventually this project gets scrapped. But as I mentioned, the technology that they developed for it, the steel skin, the bomb bay doors, some of the other things, allow it to sort of be the precursor to weapons that we're going to use in World War II. After World War I, the military builds a base in Langley, Virginia. They decide they're going to move all the aeronautic design from Wright Field out to Langley because it was on the East Coast. It was a little bit, people didn't like flying all the way out to Dayton. The city of Dayton said, hold on a second, the Wright brothers are here. This is, we've sort of been the forefront of aviation technology. What the business leaders in Dayton do is they get together, they raise about $4 million in a short time period, which back then was a huge amount of money, and they purchase about 8,000 acres to give to the U.S. government as one of the bases. So the U.S. government accepts that gift, and then we get the Wright Field. As I mentioned before, we had Wilbur Wright Field already. That was named for Wilbur because he had passed away at that point. As they actually give the field to the U.S. government, they decide to name it after both brothers. And Orville Wright is actually at the dedication of the first one. He raises the flag over what is now Wright Field. This is just an image of some of the first buildings that were there in 1927. And as 1927, you got this base out there. You got to get people from Dayton out to the base to work at the base. It wasn't all just military personnel. There were a lot of civilians. So as you can see here, you got some dapper young ladies and a few gentlemen heading out on the train out to Wright Field. It's about a 10-mile ride from Dayton to where Wright-Patterson is at. Back then, cars were not as prevalent. So a lot of people took the interurban train system out there, and you get off at the stop here, and then you go in through the main gates. Oops. Sorry, gotta go back here. Everybody asks the question, well, where did Patterson come from? Everybody understands the Wright Field. Where did Patterson Field come from? Well, it came from a gentleman named Frank Stewart Patterson here. He was a test pilot at Wright Field back in World War I. Unfortunately, he has an accident and is killed in a test pilot flight. His uncle, if you're from the Dayton area, you might have heard of NCR cash registers. A cash register was developed in Dayton, Ohio. his uncle owned that company. He was also very instrumental in raising all the money that got the land for the base. So they designated a portion of it Patterson Field in 1931. You still have Wright Field on one side, and you have Patterson Field on the other. And they're two separate bases. This is an image of Wright Field in 1939. If you're familiar with 1939, that is a date that Hitler moves into Poland. And we start seeing that the war is coming. World War II is coming at that point. Wright Field has some small hangars. We still have fields out here, but you also have a lot of agriculture. These are all private farms that were around this thing. But as I mentioned, we know that the war is coming. We don't get in until 41, but they start doing a massive construction project out there. We're training more and more pilots. We're training more aeronautic engineers, those type of things. So we're building a lot of these barrack buildings. Whether it's churches or gyms or mess halls, all those things, it becomes this massive construction project. We're also building some really innovative buildings. Here's just one of the larger hangars that is built out of concrete. Before this time period, everything was out of wood. But the building I want to talk about just briefly here is Building 65. This is built in 1941 as a research and development building. If you're familiar with these two aircraft, the B-36 is probably the largest aircraft ever flown by the military. It's kind of famous because it had the 6 propellers on it and the 4 jet engines on the outside. They always said that it had 6 turning and 4 burning at any time that it was in the air. And then also the B-29 Super Fortresses. Before these were actually able to fly, they had to do testing on the fuselages, and they wanted to be able to do that inside, so they built Building 65 to do that. And as you can see here, here's an image of the B-36 on end inside that building. It's 9 stories tall, so they were able to get it in that and do the stress testing that they needed for that. And then we also see the B-29 fuselage here being stress tested. So by 1945, this is Wright Field. As you saw earlier, we had just this small core of buildings, but now we're building, concrete runways. We're building a lot more barracks, more research facilities. The Air Force Institute of Technology gets built at around this time period. We've got this large armament area where we're doing testing on armament. And then we also have a test pilot school out there. You might recognize this gentleman here with the big smile. It's Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager was a fighter ace during World War II, at the beginning of World War II. After he finishes his cycle over there, he's a war ace. He comes back, and his family lived in West Virginia. He wanted to be at the closest base to that, and ends up being at Wright-Patterson, or at Wright Field. So he becomes a pilot there at the test school. Fortunately, Chuck Yeager never graduated high school, so they didn't allow him, despite the fact that he was a fighter ace, they didn't allow him to actually be a test pilot. He had to be a maintenance officer, which basically meant test pilots would take the aircraft up, they would take it through its courses, they would bring it down, the mechanics would wrench on it for a while, and then they'd have to have a maintenance officer take the aircraft back up, kind of make sure that it was airworthy, and then they would give it back to the test pilots. Well, as you can imagine, Chuck didn't take too kindly to being just the guy to test these things out. So when he would do his test flights, his maintenance flights, he kind of pushed the limits of what was going on. A lot of the military personnel there kind of said, hey, we need to send him off and get his education completed so he can become a test pilot. A mere 3 years after he serves at Wright-Patterson is when he breaks the sound barrier in 1947. I also like to tell the story, at this time, Wright-Patterson is the hub of all things aeronautic design-wise. We're also doing a lot of top secret things as well. This is a project that was called Project Silver Plate. You've seen the Oppenheimer movie lately. The U.S. military was looking for the platform that they were going to drop the atomic bombs. So what they did is they made full-scale mock-ups of both Fat Boy and Thin Man. They brought them to Wright-Patterson. They got the B-29 Super Fortress is what they figured was going to be their platform. But they had to modify the fuselage to get this thing in there. and to be able to drop it successfully. So that project, Silver Plate, took place in Hangar 1 out at Wright Field. Also, I think I mentioned earlier, Hap Arnold, he learned to fly from the Wright brothers back in 1910 at Wright Field. And during World War II, he's the commander of all military forces in the European theater of all aviation forces. One of the things he does is every time they capture an enemy aircraft in Europe, what they would do is they'd fly one of those examples back to the United States. They'd fly to Wright-Patterson and have all of our engineers sort of look at it, try to reverse engineer technology that we could possibly use. So at any given time in the 40s, you might see, a Messerschmitt, you might see all those different aircraft on the airstrip. It was called Operation Lusty, not for anything dirty, but because it stood for Luftwaffe Secret Technology Program. And we had a little bit of everything out there, as I mentioned. The ME-163B, most of you probably have heard of it as the Comet. The Comet was the very first aircraft that was rocket-powered. The Germans developed that. It was not a successful aircraft. It basically killed almost every test pilot that ever flew it. They either crashed it into the ground, it either exploded, or the jet fuel that they used, the rocket fuel that they used, was so corrosive it ended up usually burning the lungs out of their test pilots. So we didn't really use a lot off that one. But that aircraft is actually at the National Museum of the Air Force if you visit. I like this photo. It doesn't look like much, but if you look in detail, there was just every aircraft that the Air Force was flying at that time, actually it was still the Army Air Corps at this time, would have been out there on Wright Field. So you would see Japanese Zeros, you'd see Messerschmitts, you'd see everything that was flying in the European and Pacific theater out here. As I mentioned before, that we have two separate fields. We have Patterson Field. This is 1939. I show this because you can see we still got grass strips before we get into World War II. We have the same sort of construction projects that start going on out there, all the same sort of buildings being built. But by 1945, you can see we've got the large concrete runways. We're flying B-29s off of these things on a regular basis, as well as the B-36. And we're also building more and more technology buildings. As I mentioned before, the hangars were built out of wood, but in 28 we started experimenting with steel hangars, and we a lot more of those there as well. Story I like to tell also is Wright Field had a POW compound. We brought POWs from the European theater to the United States. They were basically throughout the United States at various different bases. At one time, Wright Field had about 400 German POWs, mainly from the North African campaign. And we had the full compounds. We had the guard towers and everything else that were located here at Wright Field. The reason I tell this story, can anybody guess what the #1 question I'm asked about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is? #1 question. Oh, come on. Nobody knows about the aliens at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? That's the #1 question I get, is where are the aliens at? This kind of leads into the story of how the aliens came into being. The POWs that were brought over here, they were not professional soldiers. They had basically just been taken into the Army and fought. So they all had day jobs. A good portion of the POWs who were brought to Wright-Patterson, or to Wright Field, were children's books illustrators. They were artists, those type of things. So one of the things that they tried to do was, and here's the aliens. You might have seen the Roswell story from 1947. Probably heard of Hangar 18. You might have heard that as well. I'll just tell you, between us, this is Building 18 at Wright-Patterson. There are no aliens in there. But anyway, the POWs, as they worked at Wright Field, they were all messed in the same place. They took their lunches and their dinners in the same location. The guards at that time wanted to keep them occupied, just keep them busy with things to do. So a lot of the illustrators started using the walls as their own little canvases. And they started drawing pictures from their Norse mythology, from their children's books, the stories that they had learned. So they draw these very intricate goblins and trolls on the walls there. The reason I tell this as part of the alien story is everybody asks, well, how did the myth of aliens being at Wright-Patterson probably come about? This is just supposition on my part, but I think between the fact that the Roswell story happens in 1947, if they had found anything, any kind of aliens, because of the level of scientific development that was taking place at Wright Field, it would have been where they would have sent any kind of alien technology. But then you also have these walls being documented with goblins, things that look like otherworldly beasts. So probably people walking through these buildings thought, well, maybe there's something secret behind this. So that's just my little story of how I think the aliens probably, the myth came about. Anyway, World War II ends. We have 1947. And if you're familiar with that date, if you're in the Air Force, you know that that is when we officially became the Air Force. No longer a subset of the U.S. Army. We become our own branch of the service, and this is just a celebration at Wright Field. At that time, they decided they're merging both of them into one Air Force base, and it becomes Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We're no longer Wright Field and Patterson Field. This is just a map showing how it all comes together. Better to see an actual aerial view of it, but this is Patterson Field, and this is Wright Field up here at the top. It all becomes one base. We've got a roadway that sort of separates the two even to this day. But as you can see, the runways are getting longer and longer because we're flying larger and larger aircraft out of here. This image is from 1954. We start flying B-52s very shortly after that time period. So we needed a very, very long runway for that. 1963 through 1975, we have the 43rd Strategic Wing. As I mentioned, we've got the B-52s that are flying out of our base. Stratoforge, we've got probably about 8 to 10 of those at any given time. We were a SAC base at that time. So we had the B-52s, we had the F-86 Sabres as their defensive escorts. And then we also started developing the KC-135 as a refueling aircraft for that. So those are all being flown out of Wright-Patterson Field at that time period. As I mentioned, the F-86, we're still doing testing on that with the firing range. We're getting out there and actually firing it straight out of the aircraft itself out onto the armament area. We're also still the hub of all technology that's being developed through the Air Force. This image just shows the F-105B and all the different components that were developed at Wright Field through all the different scientists that go into that aircraft. We're also doing a lot of testing. Eventually, when we get into Vietnam, we start doing work with the Wild Weasel and SAM detection and evasion, basically. The F-115 Eagle is being developed here, and then we also see the prototype for the F-16 is being developed at Wright Field as well. I also like to tell sort of the stories of some of the buildings there and how it relates to aviation. This unassuming building up here is 821. It was built in 1942, and the unique story about that building was it's completely built of wood and glass alone. There's absolutely no metal in that building. People ask, well, why'd you skip screws and nails and all that other stuff? The reason is in 42 they started doing experimentation with radar invasion. They're doing some early technology that eventually turns into stealth technology. Skunk Works ran out of this building for a long time, but F-117 Nighthawk, the technology that was developed there, or for that aircraft, was developed in the barn. We lovingly call it the barn. Some people think it's a blimp hangar, but they're doing a lot of testing in that building as well. Another building I like to tell a little story about too is Building 470. It's a nuclear reactor. We built this right after World War II. And at the time that it was built and actually taken into commission, it was the 7th largest nuclear reactor in the United States. The reason they built it there was because right after World War II, somebody had the idea of, hey, can we actually power an aircraft with nuclear power? Can we get a nuclear reactor into the air to power the engines? So they started doing testing with the B-36. As you can see, this image up here is them flying, and you can see it's got the nuclear symbol on the back. As you can imagine, if you have a nuclear reactor in an aircraft, you've got to shield this thing with an unbelievable amount of lead to protect the pilots and the crew that are in this thing. So it doesn't really become a very successful project because of the weight of it. It just really didn't make a lot of sense. I am told, but I have not gotten confirmation, that they were able to get a nuclear reaction to take place in the aircraft, but at no point were they ever able to use that power to power the aircraft itself. But just an interesting story. That's not successful. They decommissioned the nuclear reactor in the early 70s, but it's still used for our radiation program today. We also, at Wright-Patterson, is the home of the NASIC, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center. It started all the way back in 1951 as the Air Technical Intelligence Center, moves on to the Foreign Technology Division. Another quick tie to the aliens, if any of you have ever heard of a project called Project Blue Book, which took place in the late 50s, early 60s, all the way up to the 70s and 80s. That was a project where the Air Force collected every story of any kind of unexplained flying object that took place in the United States. That project was actually based out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So every story about any kind of UFO went through the Foreign Technology Division and then later the National Air and Space Center. Late 70s to early 90s, we're with the 4950th Test Wing. That time, over Dayton, Ohio, we're flying a bunch of very odd-looking aircraft. As you can see, we're modifying these things with radar in the front, radar on top, radar on back. We're doing a lot of initial testing, so the test wing was very instrumental in some of the aircraft that we still fly today for reconnaissance. But eventually, in 1994, we become the 445th Airlift Wing. That's still the mission that we have today. We started off flying the C-5 Galaxies, which if you've seen one of those things, it is a very large aircraft. We had probably about 10 of them at one time. We also then have the C-141 Starlifter that we're flying out of that. But eventually we end up with the C-17 Globemaster III. It's the aircraft that we still fly out of Wright-Patterson. One of the things that I highly encourage folks to visit Dayton, Ohio, and as I mentioned, I'm part of the National Park Service team. Huffman Prairie is there, where the brothers originally developed the first controlled flight. Huffman Prairie is literally at the end of our runway. The U.S. Air Force still owns Huffman Prairie. We own it. The National Park Service tells the mission of it, or the history of it. But it's an incredible experience to be at Huffman Prairie and to see a C-17 fly over probably about 500 feet right above you there at the prairie. But as I mentioned, we're still flying this aircraft throughout the world and based there in Dayton, Ohio. The last thing I'll leave you with is, as I mentioned, McCook Field starts in 1917. Wilbur Wright Field starts in 1917. They're doing all kinds of testing. They're doing all kinds of research. And somebody gets the brilliant idea in 1917 is, hey, we can't just throw this stuff away after, the new thing comes in play. Prior to that, people were just throwing stuff away. Somebody gets the idea, we need to create a museum of all the artifacts that shows the development of the aircraft. So from 1917 through 1954, the Air Force kept a museum of all these artifacts, planes, research, that type of thing. But it was only private. I mean, it was still top secret. It was secure. In 1954, the government decides, hey, we can have a museum that we can see, let the general public see. So the first public Air Force museum is created there in Dayton, Ohio, on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The building is it was a hangar through the World War II. Unfortunately, the way it was built, it's got columns throughout it. It was kind of a building, a construction building. So most of the aircraft, they couldn't actually fit into the building, you know, because they were so large. This is the B-36 here. We've got a B-29 Super Fortress at the back. We've got B-17s. We've got a lot of large aircraft. So between 54 and 71, we just parked these outside. People could come walk around and check them out. Smaller aircraft we put inside. In 1971, we get a very generous benefactor from the Kettering family, and they decided to build the very first hangar of the National Museum of the Air Force. Unfortunately, that building that I just showed you was at the Patterson Field side of it. They built the Air Force Museum on the Wright Field side of it. So all those aircraft we had to get from one side to the other. Fortunately, most of them still flew, so we could actually fly a lot of them from one field to the other and put them in there. But there were some that no longer flew anymore because of either being too dangerous or because all the seals and things like that had deteriorated. So for a good portion of 1971, we were actually moving aircraft right down the highway. Literally, there's a road that goes between the two bases. They would take all the traffic signs off that, you know, the speed limit signs so the wings wouldn't clip these things. But this is the very first rocket or jet engine bomber. It was the B-70 Valkyrie, which we still have at the museum now. It was taken down the road and brought to the new museum here. It's actually parked right out here, you can see. That's in 1971. From 1971 to today, we've actually added 3 more hangars to the museum. So I highly encourage you to take an opportunity to go back into the other corner over here. The National Museum has a booth. They can tell you all about making a visit to the National Museum, and then visit the National Park Service booth and myself to talk about visiting Huffman Prairie and the National Dayton Aviation Heritage National Park. So this is just an image inside one of the galleries. This was built in 2017. It was just opened. If you visited before 2017, you might have seen some of the presidential aircraft out in one of the hangars on the base itself. It was a restoration hangar. They eventually moved them into this new hangar. So we've got presidential aircraft there. Excuse me. We've got some NASA training modules for the space shuttle. We've got our global outreach aircraft, which is the C-17 and some other ones. So highly encourage you to make a trip out and visit us in Dayton. The last slide I'll leave you with just kind of tells the some of the stats about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We have about, this slide's a little old, but we got about 35,000 employees at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The vast majority of those are civilian scientists. So we are still the leading edge aeronautic research and development facility in the United States. It is the largest single-site employer in the state of Ohio. As I mentioned, this slide's a little old. Originally, we were at economic impact of $4.2 billion. I think we're closer to about $7 billion today. Our base covers more than about 8,000 acres, and then it provides support for almost 100 different missions. It is a very large base. We've got the 88th Air Base Wing there. We've got the 445th Airlift Wing that I'd mentioned before. Air Force Material Command, if you've seen the Air Force Pavilion over there, it has the Air Force Material Command, Life Cycle Management Group, the research laboratories, which AFRL is also in the corner over here if you'd like to visit their booth. They'll tell you about all the things they're doing with drones and technology today. National Air and Space Intelligence Center is still there, which is the hub of all intelligence collection for the Air Force. The Air Force Institute of Technology, which I mentioned started all the way back in the 40s, is still there today, where we train a lot of aviation civil engineers. And then we also have the National Museum of the Air Force. So with that, I think I'm right at my time. I appreciate your attention. I'll answer any questions that you have. If you don't want to ask them in a public forum, I'm going to be over at the National Park Service booth, more than happy to answer. Any questions from anybody? Sir?
Do you have interest in a specific development project of the airport? How do you access that?
There are several books on the various different programs, and actually, if you stop by my booth over here, I've got a book that has the development of every sort of project at Wright-Patterson, not necessarily the entire Air Force, but at Wright-Patterson from 1917 basically on. So, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.